In the gritty shadows of Brooklyn, 12-year-old Kelvin scrapes by, digging through trash to feed his dying mom until he pulls a drowning man from the East River. That man, Randy, a man who has lost everything to betrayal, a cheating wife, a scheming friend, and a fortune on the line. One boy's courage sparks an unlikely bond, but as Randy lifts Kelvin from the streets, whispers turn to poison. Greed becomes a weapon and a man's kindness becomes his greatest mistake. Who's plotting to kill whom, and can a kid with nothing save a man with everything? Twice, like, comment and subscribe, and let's dive in and find out what happens next. The scene opens in the pre-dawn haze of Brooklyn, where the streets hum with the distant clatter of delivery trucks and the occasional siren piercing the silence. 12-year-old Kelvin, his deep brown skin weathered by sun and struggle, crouches beside a rusted dumpster in an alley near the East River. His hands, rough with calluses, sift through piles of trash, broken bottles, soggy newspapers, and the occasional glint of metal. He pulls out a jagged piece of iron scrap, inspecting it with a practiced eye before tossing it into a fraying sack slung over his shoulder. The sack clinks faintly with each addition, a meager symphony of survival. Around him, the air carries the sour tang of garbage and the briny bite of the nearby river. Kelvin moves to another bin, climbing onto a crate to reach deeper, his torn sneakers slipping slightly on the damp metal. He grunts as he unearths a bent pipe, holding it up to the dim streetlight to gauge its worth. A rat skitters past, and he doesn't flinch. He's seen worse. After filling his sack, he trudges through the labyrinth of backstreets to a scrapyard, its chain-link fence sagging under years of neglect. The dealer, a grizzled man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, barely looks up as Kelvin dumps the haul onto a scale. $3. The dealer mutters, flicking ash. Kelvin squares his narrow shoulders, his voice steady despite his age. That's $5 worth, easy. Pipe's solid. The dealer squints, then tosses a crumpled $5 bill onto the counter with a grunt. Kelvin pockets it, his face unreadable but his eyes sharp with quiet triumph. He stops at a corner bodega, the flickering neon sign casting shadows across his face. With the $5, he buys a day-old loaf of bread and a small bottle of water, tucking them under his arm as he hurries back toward the river. The camera follows him past graffiti-streaked walls and flickering streetlights to a vacant lot where a tarp lean-to clings to a crumbling brick wall. Inside, Judy lies on a pile of threadbare blankets, her thin frame trembling with a wet, rattling cough. Her face, once warm and full, is now hollowed by sickness and years on the streets. Kelvin kneels beside her, brushing a strand of graying hair from her forehead. Some nights, when the scraps don't sell, they've had to eat what the bins offer: half-rotten apples, soggy bread crusts, a bruised banana split between them. Last night was one of those nights, and the memory lingers in the faint growl of Kelvin's stomach as he tears the bread in half. He hands Judy the larger piece, pouring a trickle of water into a chipped mug for her. She tries to sit up, wincing, and he steadies her with a gentle hand. After having the meal, they go to sleep with Kelvin looking at the ceiling, hoping for a better day ahead. The scene begins in the late afternoon, the sky over Brooklyn a bruised gray, heavy with the promise of rain. Kelvin, still hauling his sack of iron scraps from earlier, trudges along the muddy banks of the East River, his sneakers sinking into the damp earth. The wind carries the faint tang of salt and decay, and the water churns restlessly against the shore. He pauses to wipe sweat from his brow, scanning the littered bank for anything worth salvaging: a rusted hubcap, a bent nail, his sharp eyes missing nothing. The sack clinks softly as he shifts its weight, his thin frame straining under the load. Then he sees it, a figure in the distance, a man in a soaked trench coat, standing knee-deep in the river. The man, Randy, a 45-year-old accountant with a face carved by exhaustion, moves with a slow, deliberate resolve, wading deeper as the waves lap at his thighs. His shoulders slump, his head bowed, as if the water's pull is a mercy he's chasing. Kelvin freezes, squinting against the glare off the river. He drops his sack, the metal clattering against the rocks, and shouts, "Hey! What you doing?" His voice cracks through the wind, but Randy doesn't turn, doesn't stop. The water rises to his chest, his coat billowing like a dark flag. Kelvin hesitates for a split second, his breath hitching, then he sprints toward the shore, kicking off his sneakers mid-stride to lighten his load. The riverbank is a mess of jagged stones and slick mud. He slips, catching himself with a scraped palm, but doesn't slow. Hey! Man, stop! He yells again, his voice raw with urgency. Randy's head dips lower, the waves now at his shoulders, and Kelvin makes his choice. He plunges into the frigid water, gasping as the cold bites into his bones. The current tugs at his legs, but he pushes forward, arms slicing through the waves. Randy's just out of reach, his movements sluggish, almost dreamlike, as if he's already half gone. Kelvin lunges, grabbing the man's arm with both hands, his fingers digging into the wet fabric of the trench coat. You ain't doing this. He grunts, pulling with all his strength. Randy resists weakly, muttering something incoherent, his eyes glassy with despair. The water fights them both, swirling around their waists as Kelvin yanks harder, dragging Randy step by step toward the shore. A wave crashes over them, and Kelvin coughs, spitting out salt water, but he doesn't let go. Finally, they stumble onto the muddy bank, collapsing in a heap. Kelvin lands on his knees, chest heaving, his soaked clothes clinging to his skinny frame. Randy sprawls beside him, coughing and shivering, his face a mask of shame and confusion. The river roars behind them, cheated of its prize. Kelvin wipes mud from his eyes, staring at the man he's just saved, his breath coming in sharp bursts. Randy's hands tremble as he pushes himself up, his trench coat dripping, his once polished shoes caked with grime. For a long moment, they just sit there, the wind howling between them, two strangers bound by a single, reckless act. Kelvin and Randy sit side by side, still soaked from the river, their breaths visible in the cooling air. Kelvin's skinny frame shivers slightly, his wet clothes clinging to him, but his dark eyes are steady, fixed on the churning water beside him. Randy hunches forward, his trench coat a sodden mess, his hands resting limp on his knees. The river laps at the shore, a restless murmur that fills the silence between them. Kelvin picks up a small stone, tossing it into the waves with a soft plunk, waiting for Randy to speak. Randy finally breaks the quiet, his voice rough as gravel, cracked by exhaustion and shame. He stares at the horizon, avoiding Kelvin's gaze, and begins to unravel his story. He's 45, an accountant who thought he had it all, a brownstone in Park Slope, a wife named Sarah, a best friend named Paul. But that morning, he found emails on Sarah's laptop. Love notes between her and Paul, plans to divorce him, to drain his savings and leave him with nothing. They've been laughing at me, he says, his voice breaking. Years of trust, gone, I got nothing left, what's the point? Kelvin listens, his face unreadable, the stone throwing paused. He shifts closer, mud squelching under his knees, and tilts his head, his eyes sharp with a wisdom no 12-year-old should carry. He doesn't interrupt, not yet, just lets Randy spill it all, the betrayal cutting deeper with every word. Randy's hands clench into fists, then loosen, defeated. I walked into that river, 'cause I couldn't see a way out, he admits, almost to himself. Everything I built, it's ashes now. Kelvin lets the silence hang for a beat, then speaks, his voice low but firm. So you think me and my mom should be dead too? Randy blinks, startled, turning to face him. Kelvin keeps going, his words slow and deliberate, pulling from a well of lived pain. We ain't got nothing, no house, no money, not even a real bed. Ma's sick, coughing up her lungs every night, and I'm out there digging through trash just to get her a piece of bread. Some days we eat what the rats leave behind, 'cause the scraps don't sell. You sayin' that's meaningless? That we got no point, 'cause we ain't got luxury? Randy freezes, the boy's words slicing through his self-pity like a blade. He opens his mouth to respond, but nothing comes out. Kelvin doesn't stop, his voice rising with a mix of defiance and quiet fire. I see Ma cry when she thinks I'm asleep, 'cause she hates me livin' like this. But she's still here, fightin'. I'm still here, fightin'. We don't got what you had, but we don't quit. You had a wife and a friend stab you in the back. So what? You're still breathin', ain't that somethin'? The weight of it lands hard. Randy looks at Kelvin, really looks, and sees not just a scrappy kid in torn clothes, but a mind that burns brighter than the streets could ever dim. He rubs a hand over his face, water dripping from his sleeve, and lets out a shaky laugh, more bitter than amused. You're something else, kid. How's a boy like you talk like that? Kelvin shrugs, picking up another stone and rolling it between his fingers. Ain't books or school, just livin'. You learn stuff when you got no choice. He tosses the stone, watching it skip once across the water before sinking. Ma says you figure out what matters when you're down to nothing. Guess she's right. They sit there longer, the conversation stretching into the dusk. Randy asks about Judy, how long she's been sick, how they ended up on the streets. Kelvin tells him in pieces, a dad who left when he was 5, a job Judy lost when the coughing started, a landlord who kicked them out when the rent dried up. Been 3 years now, he says, matter of fact. Scrap keeps us going. Barely. Randy listens, his despair shifting to something else. Curiosity, maybe even respect. He shakes his head. Muttering, I thought I had it bad. Kelvin glances at him, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. You do, just not bad enough to die over. Randy snorts, a real laugh this time, and the tension between them eases, replaced by a fragile thread of understanding. The river keeps flowing, the city hums in the distance, and two strangers find themselves tethered by a moment neither expected. The scene picks up as dusk deepens into night, the Brooklyn skyline a jagged silhouette against a sky streaked with fading orange. Kelvin and Randy walk from the riverbank, their clothes still damp and heavy from the earlier plunge. Kelvin's sack of scraps clinks faintly over his shoulder, retrieved after their talk, while Randy trails behind, his trench coat dripping, his steps uncertain but curious. The wind carries the faint hum of traffic and the metallic tang of rust as they approach the scrapyard, a sprawling kingdom of refuse tucked behind a vacant lot near the East River. Piles of twisted metal, old tires, and broken appliances loom like jagged sentinels, the air thick with the smell of oil and decay. Kelvin hesitates at the edge of the lot, glancing back at Randy with a flicker of unease. You sure about this? He mutters, rubbing the back of his neck. Randy nods, his face a mix of exhaustion and determination, as if seeing Kelvin's world is the only thing anchoring him now. Kelvin shrugs and leads him through a narrow path between the scrap heaps, his sneakers crunching on gravel. They reach a makeshift shelter, a sagging tarp stretched over a frame of scavenged wood, tied down with fraying rope. A faint glow spills from a cracked lantern inside, casting shadows on the dirt floor. Judy lies curled on a pile of thin blankets, her frail body half hidden under a patched coat. Her breathing is shallow, punctuated by a wet, rattling cough that echoes in the stillness. Her hair, streaked with gray, fans out across a rolled-up sweater serving as a pillow. Kelvin kneels beside her, setting the sack down gently so it doesn't wake her. He brushes a hand over her forehead, checking her temperature, his face softening with a tenderness he rarely shows. Randy stands awkwardly at the entrance, his hands shoved into his pockets, taking in the scene, the cardboard walls, the single plastic crate holding their few belongings, the stark poverty of it all. Judy stirs, her eyes fluttering open, and she squints at the stranger looming behind her son. Kel, who's that? She rasps, her voice weak but edged with suspicion. Kelvin glances back at Randy, then at her. Just some guy I met, Ma. He's okay. Randy steps forward, offering a clumsy nod. Name's Randy. Your boy helped me out today. Judy's gaze sharpens, but she doesn't press, too tired to argue. She coughs again, wincing, and Kelvin grabs a chipped mug, pouring a splash of water from a dented canteen. Randy lingers, unsure, until Kelvin gestures to a spot on the dirt floor. You stayin' or what? He says, half challenging, half resigned. Randy lowers himself awkwardly, his trench coat pooling around him, and watches as Kelvin pulls out their scavenged meal, a bruised tomato with soft spots, a stale roll split in two, and a rind of cheese scraped from a dumpster find earlier that week. Kelvin tears the roll carefully, handing Judy the larger half and offering Randy the rest. Judy hesitates, eyeing Randy, but takes a small bite, her hands trembling. Randy follows suit, biting into the tomato, the juice dribbling down his chin. He chews slowly, then mutters, "This ain't half bad," almost surprised. The night stretches on, the three of them eating in near silence, the lantern flickering as the wind tugs at the tarp. Judy drifts back to sleep, her cough quieter now, and Kelvin stokes a small fire in a metal can, the glow warming the cramped space. Randy watches the flames, then Kelvin, who pokes at the embers with a stick. You do this every night? Randy asks, his voice low. Kelvin nods, not looking up. Most nights. Keeps the cold out. Randy leans back against a rusted fender, the scavenged meal settling in his stomach, and realizes it's the first time in years he's tasted something real, not the overpriced steaks or fancy wine he once chased, but something earned, shared. As dawn creeps in, the first light filtering through the scrapyard's tarp, casting faint stripes across the dirt floor, Kelvin stirs awake beside the smoldering fire can, the embers barely warm now. Judy sleeps fitfully nearby, her cough softer but still persistent, her thin frame bundled in blankets. Randy, slumped against a rusted fender, blinks awake, his trench coat stiff with dried mud and river water. He rubs his eyes, taking in the lean-to, the cardboard walls, the cracked lantern, the faint smell of rust and smoke. Kelvin sits up, stretching his stiff limbs, and catches Randy staring. Their eyes meet, a quiet understanding lingering from the night before. Randy pushes himself to his feet, brushing dirt from his coat, and clears his throat. "This ain't right," he says, his voice hoarse but firm. "You and your mom, you're comin' with me." Kelvin freezes, his hand pausing on the sack of scraps he's started to gather. Judy stirs, woken by the words, and squints at Randy, her face pale but her gaze sharp. "What you mean?" she rasps, pulling the blanket tighter. Randy steps closer, his hands gesturing awkwardly as he finds the words. "I got a place, a brownstone in Park Slope, plenty of room. You shouldn't be livin' like this, neither of you." Kelvin narrows his eyes, wary. "We don't need pity," he says, his tone clipped. Randy shakes his head, insistent. "Ain't pity, kid, it's what's right. You pulled me out of that river, lemme pull you out of this." Judy coughs, a harsh, wrenching sound, and Randy points at her. "She's sick. You know it. I can get her help, doctors, medicine, and you're too damn smart for this dump. I'm settin' you up proper." Kelvin hesitates, glancing at Judy, who looks torn between pride and exhaustion. After a long beat, she nods faintly, her voice barely a whisper. "Okay." For Kel, the scene shifts to a montage with a gritty, hopeful pulse. Randy leads them out of the scrapyard, Kelvin carrying their few belongings in a plastic bag, a spare shirt, a cracked mug, Judy's patched coat. Judy leans on Kelvin's arm, her steps unsteady, while Randy hails a beat-up taxi. They pile in, the city blurring past, Brooklyn's rough edges giving way to Park Slope's tree-lined streets and brownstones with polished stoops. The taxi stops outside Randy's place, a 3-story brick house, its windows gleaming, a stark contrast to the tarp they left behind. Inside, the brownstone smells of wood polish and faint neglect. High ceilings, hardwood floors, furniture draped with dust sheets. Randy guides Judy to a guest room, helping her onto a real bed with clean sheets. She sinks into it, her eyes wide with disbelief, fingers brushing the fabric like it's a dream. Kelvin stands in the doorway, clutching the plastic bag, his gaze darting around, suspicious, overwhelmed. Randy claps a hand on his shoulder. "This is yours now, kid, get used to it." The montage continues. Randy drives Judy to a hospital, her cough echoing in the sterile waiting room as a doctor examines her. "Pneumonia," the doctor says, scribbling a prescription, "treatable with rest and meds." Randy pays the bill without flinching, handing over a credit card while Judy watches, her pride warring with gratitude. Back at the brownstone, he enrolls Kelvin in a private school online, tapping away at a laptop, uploading a photo of Kelvin from his phone. The boy's reluctant grin caught mid-protest. A package arrives days later, a crisp uniform, navy blazer and tie, which Kelvin holds up with a mix of awe and unease. The scene slows as Randy sits with them in the brownstone's kitchen, a simple meal of soup and bread on the table, store-bought, not scavenged. Judy sips slowly, her strength flickering back, while Kelvin picks at his bowl, still adjusting. Randy watches them, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "First day's Monday," he says, nodding at Kelvin. "School's got books, teachers, real stuff. You're gonna kill it." Kelvin smirks, a spark of curiosity breaking through his guard. "Better than trash bins, I guess." The scene opens on a crisp morning in Park Slope, the brownstone's quiet street lined with manicured trees and polished stoops. Kelvin steps out in his new school uniform, navy blazer slightly too big, tie knotted clumsily, his sneakers still scuffed from the streets. He adjusts his backpack, a hand-me-down from Randy, and heads toward the bus stop, his posture stiff with unease. Across the street, a neighbor, Mrs. Carter, a middle-aged woman with a pinched face, peers through her curtains. Her coffee mug paused mid-sip. She mutters to herself, "Who's that kid?" "And that woman in there," her husband, glancing over his paper, grunts, "Heard she's livin' with Randy now. Strange setup, if you ask me." Cut to the brownstone's interior, where Judy sits at the kitchen table, a mug of tea steaming in her hands. Her cough is softer now, the antibiotics kicking in, but her movements are slow, her eyes tracing the room's unfamiliar comforts, granite counters, a fridge that hums instead of rattles. Randy pours himself coffee, casual in a sweater, and offers her a faint smile. "Feelin' better?" he asks. She nods, hesitant. "Yeah, just ain't used to this. Feels like borrowing somebody else's life." Outside, a dog walker pauses, eyeing the house, then leans toward another neighbor on the sidewalk. "Saw her movin' in last week," she whispers, "no ring on her finger. You think she's his, you know?" The second neighbor smirks. "Mistress, maybe. Poor guy's wife ain't gonna like that." The whispers spread like smoke through the block. At a corner cafe, a group of locals sip lattes, their voices low but sharp. "Heard she's from the streets, homeless, some say," one woman murmurs, stirring her drink. "Randy's always been soft, probably took her in out of pity." A man chuckles. "Pity? Looks more like a midlife crisis to me." The gossip ripples outward, a montage of hushed tones and sidelong glances, curtains twitching, heads turning as Kelvin climbs off the school bus later that day, his uniform now wrinkled from a long day of navigating a world he doesn't yet fit into. Meanwhile, across town in a sleek Manhattan apartment, Sarah lounges on a leather couch, her blonde hair swept into a tight bun, a glass of wine in hand. Paul, lean and sharp-eyed, scrolls through his phone beside her, their affair no longer a secret between them. He pauses, smirking, and holds up the screen. Screenshots from a neighborhood group chat, forwarded by a friend. "Get this," he says, his voice smooth with glee. "Randy's got some black woman living with him now. Neighbors think she's his side piece." Sarah's eyes narrow, a slow smile curling her lips. She sets the wine down, leaning closer. "A mistress? Oh, this is gold." Paul tosses the phone onto the coffee table, stretching back with a grin. "They're sayin' she's got a kid, too." "Street trash, probably." Randy's playing savior. "Pathetic." Sarah stands, pacing the room, her heels clicking on hardwood. "No, it's perfect. We've been looking for leverage to bleed him dry in a divorce. This is a scandal we can spin." She grabs a notepad, jotting ideas, her mind racing. "We say he's been hiding her, cheating on me for years. Paint her as the homewrecker, him as the fool. Court will eat it up." Paul nods, his grin widening. "Push it hard enough, he'll lose half his assets just to shut us up, maybe more if we play the kid angle. Say he's supporting an illegitimate family." Sarah taps the pen against her chin, her voice cold. "I'll call my lawyer tomorrow, dig up dirt, photos, witnesses. Those nosy neighbors will be dying to talk." She picks up her wine again, sipping with a predator's calm. "Randy thinks he's starting over. I'll make sure he's got nothing left to start with." Back in Park Slope, the scene slows as Kelvin trudges up the brownstone steps, kicking off his sneakers. Judy greets him from the couch, a blanket over her lap, her face brighter than it's been in years. "How was it, Kel?" she asks, her voice warm. He shrugs, dropping his backpack. "Weird. Kids got phones fancier than this house." Randy steps in from the kitchen, chuckling. "You'll catch up. Give it time." Outside, Mrs. Carter watches from her window, her phone buzzing with the latest group chat. Update: saw the kid again, definitely something fishy going on. The scene pans to the brownstone, where hope and tension simmer in equal measure. The warm glow of a table lamp casting long shadows across the living room. Judy sits on the couch, a blanket draped over her lap, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbles with a bottle of pain meds prescribed for her pneumonia recovery. The bottle rattles as she shakes out a pill, then another, her movements unsteady, her eyes glassy from fatigue and the creeping haze of the drugs. A half-empty glass of water sits on the coffee table, the ice melting into a puddle. She rubs her temples, muttering to herself, her voice a low, disjointed hum. Randy steps in from the kitchen, a mug of tea in hand, his sweater sleeves rolled up. He's been cooking, pasta simmering on the stove, the faint smell of garlic drifting through the house, a rare moment of normalcy. He pauses, noticing Judy's state, and sets the mug down. "You okay?" he asks, his tone casual but edged with concern. Judy doesn't look up, her fingers tightening around the pill bottle. "Fine," she snaps, sharper than intended. Randy frowns, stepping closer. "You don't look fine. How many of those you take today?" The question ignites something in her. Judy's head jerks up, her gaze narrowing, and she slams the bottle onto the table, the pills rattling inside. "What's that supposed to mean? Are you keeping tabs on me now?" Randy raises his hands, defensive. "Just asking, Judy, you've been off all day." Her laugh is bitter. "Cutting off? I'm alive, ain't I? Thanks to you, Mr. Savior, that what this is? You pitying me?" The accusation hangs heavy, and Randy's jaw tightens, but he keeps his voice steady. "Ain't pity, you needed help, I gave it." Judy lurches to her feet, the blanket falling to the floor, her balance shaky as the meds cloud her mind. "Help? You dragged us out of the scrapyard 'cause you felt bad, poor sick woman, poor street kid. Makes you feel good, don't it? Playing the hero." Her voice rises, trembling with a mix of anger and shame. Randy steps forward, trying to calm her. "Judy, stop." "I didn't," she cuts him off, her hands balling into fists. "Don't tell me to stop. You don't know me. You don't know what it's like, watching my boy dig through trash, knowing I can't fix it." The argument spirals, voices overlapping as tension crackles. Randy tries to reason. "I'm giving you a shot, that's all." But Judy's too far gone, the pain meds fueling a rage she's buried for years. She stumbles toward the kitchen, her breath ragged, and Randy follows, worried she'll hurt herself. "Judy, sit down, you're not." She whirls on him, eyes wild, and grabs a kitchen knife from the counter, the blade glinting in the overhead light. "Don't you dare tell me what I am," she shouts, her voice breaking. Randy freezes, hands up, his tone soft but firm. "Put it down, Judy. You don't want to do this." She shakes her head, tears welling, the knife trembling in her grip. "You think you fixed us? You think this?" She gestures at the house, the knife slashing the air, "makes up for everything I couldn't give him?" Her words dissolve into a sob, and in a sudden, drug-fueled surge, she lunges forward, slashing at Randy. The blade catches his forearm, a shallow gash blooming red through his sweater. He stumbles back, clutching his arm, blood seeping between his fingers. Judy gasps, the knife clattering to the floor as the haze lifts just enough for her to see what she's done. She collapses to her knees, her hands covering her face, sobs wrenching from her chest. "I'm sorry, oh God, I'm sorry," she chokes out, rocking back and forth. Randy, breathing hard, drops to one knee beside her, ignoring the sting in his arm. Blood drips onto the tile, but he doesn't flinch. He reaches out with his good hand, resting it lightly on her shoulder. "Hey, it's okay, you're okay," he says, his voice steady despite the pain. She looks up, tears streaming, her hands shaking as she reaches for him, then pulls back, afraid to touch him. "I ain't myself. These damn pills." "I didn't mean," Randy cuts her off, gentle but firm. "I know, we're all messed up somehow, doesn't mean we can't fix it." He grabs a dish towel from the counter, wrapping it around his arm, the red soaking through as he sits beside her on the floor. The pasta boils over in the background, steam hissing, but neither moves to stop it. They stay there, the chaos settling into a raw, fragile quiet. Judy wipes her eyes, her breathing slowing, and mutters, "You shouldn't have to deal with this." Randy shakes his head, a faint smile breaking through. "Too late, I'm in it now." He helps her up, guiding her back to the couch, and grabs a blanket to drape over her shoulders. While they are there sitting in silence, the knife still on the floor, a pair of eyes is looking at them, hatching an evil plan, looking for a way to twist this incident in her favor. Sarah watches this incident unravel from a blind spot as she dials 911, and as she screams that her husband's mistress has attacked her husband in their home, the police arrive swiftly and knock on the door. Randy opens the door and is surprised to see the police. They explain that they received a call and ask if he's okay. He explains that he is and states that the issue has been resolved, and that he won't be pressing charges. Sarah steps in and follows officers down to the station where she writes a statement of what happens, but the police don't do anything since Randy doesn't press any charges, but her plans were already in motion. She plans to poison Randy and pin it on Judy since she has already slashed him before, and everyone was going to believe her and the case would be closed as an affair gone wrong and no one was ever going to suspect her, or so she thought. The scene opens on a quiet evening in Park Slope, the brownstone bathed in the soft glow of streetlights filtering through drawn curtains. Inside, the kitchen hums with domestic calm. Randy stirs a pot of creamy pasta on the stove, the air thick with the scent of garlic and parmesan. Judy rests upstairs, her recovery steady but slow, the faint sound of her turning pages in a book drifting down. Kelvin sits at the dining room table, surrounded by wires, a small camera, and a cracked laptop, a school project on basic CCTV systems, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tweaks the setup. A grainy feed flickers on the screen, showing the front stoop in real time. Outside, Sarah approaches, her blonde hair tucked under a dark scarf, her movements deliberate and silent. She clutches a small vial in her gloved hand, the liquid inside colorless but deadly, a poison sourced from Paul's shady contacts, meant to mimic a heart attack. She's cased the house for days, waiting for a moment when Randy's guard is down. The front door lock clicks softly as she picks it with a practiced hand. Slipping inside like a shadow, the living room is dim, the only sound the low hum of the fridge and Kelvin's muttered adjustments in the next room. Sarah creeps toward the kitchen, pausing at the threshold as Randy turns to grab a plate from the cabinet, his back to her. She ducks behind the island, her breath shallow, and waits until he steps out to call up to Judy, "Dinner's ready in 5." His footsteps fading toward the stairs, seizing the moment, she darts to the stove, uncorks the vial, and pours the poison into his wine, stirring it in with a spoon. The creamy sauce masks the faint shimmer of the liquid, and she slips the vial back into her pocket, a cold smirk tugging at her lips. She retreats to the living room, her heels silent on the hardwood. Meanwhile, in the dining room, Kelvin adjusts the camera angle, the feed shifting to catch a sliver of the kitchen doorway. His eyes narrow as he spots a flicker of movement, a shadow that doesn't belong. He leans closer, tweaking the contrast, and freezes as Sarah's gloved hand appears on the screen, the vial glinting briefly before disappearing. His breath catches, mind racing. He's seen enough crime shows to know what's up. He grabs a screwdriver from his toolkit, clutching it like a weapon, and creeps toward the kitchen, his sneakers quiet but his pulse loud in his ears. Randy returns, humming faintly, and serves himself a plate of pasta, and grabs his wine, the steam rising as he sits at the dining table, oblivious. Sarah lingers in the living room, watching from the corners of her eyes, her exit delayed by the need to confirm he eats. Kelvin slips into the kitchen doorway, catching sight of her silhouette, then backtracks to the table just as Randy lifts his glass. The poisoned wine inches from his mouth. "Randy, don't drink that!" Kelvin shouts, lunging forward to knock the wine from his hand. It shatters on impact, wine spilling, and Randy jolts back, startled. "What the hell, kid?" Kelvin points toward the living room, his voice urgent. "She's here, saw her on the camera. She put something in it." Randy's eyes widen, and he stands, chair scraping, as Sarah steps into the light, her scarf slipping to reveal her face. "Kelvin, you little," she hisses, her calm fracturing. Randy stares, disbelief hardening into anger. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" She recovers fast, forcing a smile. "Just checking on you, hon, kid's got an imagination." But Kelvin's already at his laptop, pulling up the feed, grainy but clear, Sarah's gloved hand, the vial, the pour. He spins the screen toward Randy. "Look." Sarah lunges for the laptop, but Randy grabs her arm, his grip tight. "What did you put in it?" he demands, voice low and dangerous. She twists free, backing toward the door, her composure unraveling. "You're paranoid, both of you." Kelvin darts to block her exit, screwdriver still in hand, his small frame defiant. "Ain't leaving till you talk." Randy dials 911 on his phone, his eyes never leaving her. Police, now, stay put, Sarah. The tension peaks as footsteps thud upstairs. Judy, roused by the noise, peers down from the landing, her face pale but alert. What's going on? She calls, clutching the railing. Sarah seizes the distraction, shoving past Kelvin and bolting for the door, but Randy catches her scarf, yanking her back. She stumbles, cursing, as sirens wail in the distance, growing louder. Kelvin grabs the plate of pasta, holding it up like evidence. She tried to kill you, Randy, I saw it. Sarah glares, trapped, her plan crumbling as red and blue lights flash through the windows. The scene picks up moments after Sarah's failed escape, the brownstone pulsing with tension as red and blue police lights flash through the windows, painting the walls in stark, shifting hues. Sarah stands cornered in the living room, her scarf dangling from Randy's grip, her blonde hair disheveled as she glares at him and Kelvin. Two officers burst through the front door, their radios crackling, hands resting on holsters, hands where we can see M. One barks, and Sarah raises hers slowly, her jaw tight, her eyes darting for an exit that isn't there. Randy steps back, still clutching the scarf, his arm bleeding faintly through the dish towel from Judy's earlier slash, now a minor ache. Amid the chaos, Kelvin stands firm by the dining table, the laptop open with the damning CCTV footage paused on Sarah's gloved hand pouring the vial into the pasta. He holds pieces of the cup like a trophy, his voice steady despite his racing heart. It's all here. She did it, tried to kill him. Judy hovers at the staircase landing, gripping the railing, her face pale but her eyes fierce as she watches the scene unfold. The lead officer, a burly man with a notepad, approaches Kelvin. You got proof, kid? Kelvin nods, rewinding the feed and hitting play, grainy but unmistakable. Sarah's calculated move, the vial, the stir. The officer's brow lifts, impressed. That'll do it. Sarah's composure cracks as the second officer cuffs her wrists, the metal clicking shut with a finality that echoes in the room. This is ridiculous, she snaps, twisting against the restraint. He's framing me, him and that brat. Randy steps forward, his voice low and cold. Sarah, you poison my wine, ain't no frame job. It's you. The officer with the notepad gestures to the spilled wine. We'll test it. If it's laced, you're done. Sarah's eyes flicker with panic, but she forces a laugh, shrill and hollow. You've got nothing real, it's circumstantial. The police usher her toward the door, but she digs in her heels, her voice rising. You think you've won, Randy? You're still a fool. Kelvin pipes up, defiant. Ain't winning if you're the one in cuffs. The officers haul her outside, her protests fading into the night as neighbors peer from their stoops, drawn by the sirens. Mrs. Carter, the nosy one from across the street, clutches her phone, already texting the group chat. Told you something was off. Inside, the lead officer stays behind, taking statements. Randy sits heavily on the couch, rubbing his face, while Kelvin hovers nearby, the adrenaline still buzzing in his veins. Judy shuffles down the stairs, blanket around her shoulders, and sinks beside Randy, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a silent apology for her earlier outburst. The officer scribbles as Randy recounts the night, Sarah's break-in, Kelvin's save, then turns to the laptop. Smart kid, he mutters, bagging it as evidence. This'll hold up. The scene shifts to a police station interrogation room, stark and fluorescent lit. Sarah sits across from a detective, her cuffs off but her hands fidgeting. The detective slides a lab report across the table, traces of a lethal toxin in the wine, matched to the vial found in her purse. It's over, he says, voice flat. Talk, or we pin it all on you. Sarah's defiance crumbles, her shoulders slumping as she stares at the report. After a long beat, she mutters, it was Paul's idea. Her confession spills out. Paul orchestrated the hit, aiming to kill Randy for a hefty insurance payout, splitting it with her after the divorce. He got the poison, set it up, I just followed through. The detective nods, recording every word, her fate sealed. Back at the brownstone, days later, Randy sits at the kitchen table with a stack of legal papers, his divorce finalized, signed by a judge that morning. The assets, house, savings, all of it, stay his. Sarah's scheme gutted by the evidence. Kelvin bursts in from school, uniform rumpled, a math test with a red A in hand. "Check it," he grins, tossing it to Randy. Judy follows, her cough nearly gone, a faint flush of health in her cheeks. She pours coffee, her hands steady now, and sits with them. "Heard from the lawyer," Randy says, folding the papers. "She's locked up. Paul too, we're clear." The scene lingers as they share a quiet moment, the weight of the past weeks lifting. Outside, the neighbors' whispers have shifted, less suspicion, more grudging awe at Kelvin's heroics. Randy claps Kelvin on the shoulder, his voice gruff but warm. "You're something else, kid." Judy smiles, small but real, "The first in years." "We're something else," she corrects, and the trio settles into a fragile, hard-won peace. The brownstone no longer just a house, but a home. The scene opens on a golden late afternoon in Park Slope, the brownstone stoop bathed in warm sunlight filtering through the trees. Randy and Kelvin sit side by side on the steps, the air crisp with the first hints of fall. Randy leans back, hands braced on the stone, his sweater loose and comfortable, a stark contrast to the soaked trench coat of their first meeting. Kelvin, in a slightly less oversized school uniform, kicks at a pebble, his sneakers now replaced with a pair scuffed from playground games rather than dumpster dives. The faint clatter of dishes drifts from inside, mingling with Judy's laughter, a sound still rare but growing stronger, echoing through the open window above. Inside, Judy moves through the kitchen, her steps steadier than they've been in years. She's chopping vegetables, carrots, onions, a luxury once unthinkable, her hands sure as she preps a stew, the antibiotics and rest having chased the pneumonia's shadow from her lungs. Her cough is a memory now, replaced by a faint hum of an old song she used to sing to Kelvin as a baby. A radio plays softly on the counter, filling the space with a soulful tune, and she sways a little, a smile tugging at her lips. The brownstone's walls, once cold and foreign, now bear traces of her touch, a patched quilt draped over the couch, a photo of Kelvin in his uniform pinned to the fridge. The montage of their new life, unfolding with a gentle, hopeful rhythm. Kelvin races through the school courtyard, laughing with a group of boys, his backpack bouncing as he dodges a tossed basketball. In a classroom, he stands at a whiteboard, chalk in hand, solving a math problem with a confidence that silences the room, his teacher nodding, impressed. At home, he sprawls on the living room rug, books open, scribbling notes while Judy watches from the armchair, her pride quiet but fierce. Randy joins him sometimes, peering over his shoulder, offering a gruff, "Good work, kid," that makes Kelvin's grin widen. Randy, too, rebuilds. He's back at his accounting firm, his desk cluttered with spreadsheets, but his eyes are clearer, his shoulders less hunched. He fields calls with a steady voice, reclaiming the life Sarah and Paul nearly stole. Evenings find him in the garage, tinkering with an old radio he's fixing for Judy, a project that fills the house with static and laughter when it crackles to life. The divorce papers, now filed away, are a closed chapter. The brownstone, his assets, his dignity, all intact, thanks to Kelvin's sharp eyes and a justice system that worked for once. Randy pulls a small object from his pocket, a worn keychain shaped like a fish, a relic from a fishing trip with his dad long ago. He hands it to Kelvin, who turns it over, curious. "Kept me going when things got dark," Randy says, his voice low. "Figure you should have it now." Kelvin pockets it, nodding, a silent pact between them. The pebble he's been kicking skitters down the steps, and he leans back, mirroring Randy's pose. The two of them watching the street settle into dusk, kids biking past, leaves rustling, a neighborhood alive around them. Judy steps onto the stoop, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her face flushed from cooking. "Stew's on," she calls, her voice warm, carrying a strength that's returned bit by bit. She sits beside them, the trio filling the steps, and the camera pulls back to frame them against the brownstone, solid, weathered. "There's," a neighbor waves from across the street, "Mrs. Carter," her suspicion softened into a grudging nod, and Randy lifts a hand in return, a small victory over the whispers. From the streets to salvation, Kelvin, Judy, and Randy found a family in the fight, but their story's just beginning. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because next time, the